you have a good relationship with that customer and they're willing to pay you on time and they've done it historically, it's easy to pick up the phone and say, hey, I have a little bit of a concern of what's going on. We've been trending in this direction. The last month or so, things have been kind of looking in a different direction. Is there something that I'm doing, right? Is there a flaw in my process? And how can we improve that to make sure that, as you're processing our invoices, that we could, keep up in the same payment cycle that we've been doing this whole time?
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our #1 priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at the independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. If there are any departments that have seen the majority of automation, they are AR and AP. Most companies, even QuickBooks, would use some form of automation to manage their AR and AP. The automation could be auto-parsing and capturing the PDF documents to manage their entire workflow. The experience around AR and AP processes has changed as well, because now even the customers expect their invoices in one place. So which KPIs do AR and AP need to use to measure their efficiency? In today's episode, we invited a panel of cross-functional experts for a live interview on LinkedIn who brings significant expertise to discuss the top KPIs for AR or AP. We discussed the differences between these roles and how the roles might differ per geography, size of the company, and the industry. We also discussed the top KPIs that they need to be successful in their roles. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. And if you are joining for the first time, this is part of our digital transformation series, for which we meet every Thursday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. We used to actually meet every Thursday. Now we are missing a couple of them, but this is still interesting. So for today, we are going to be discussing the KPIs for AR. This is going to be a lot of fun because in my mind, the AR is primarily a sales job and AP could be a sales job as well. So this is always interesting. Before we dig into that, we are going to start with everybody's intros. I am going to start with my intro. If you don't know me, Sam Gupta, principal at Elevate IQ. Elevate IQ is the independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm. On that note, I am going to move to Chris for his intro.
Thanks, Sam. Chris Garridini, president and owner of Turnkey Technologies. We're almost a 30-year-old Dynamics implementation partner, so glad to be here.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Chris. Abu, can I ask you to introduce yourself next?
Sure. My name is Abu. I lead the group here at Penny. We are a Sage X3 partner for the last 12 years.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here. Nirav, can I go for you next?
Yeah, absolutely. Pleasure to be here, Sam. Nirav Shah, CEO of AdService ERP. We are an Acumatica partner.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here. Mark, can I go for you next?
Sure. Hi, Mark Keynes. Delighted to be here. I'm the president and CEO of BlueLink ERP. We are the authors and implementers of ERP for mid-sized distributors, wholesalers, etc.
Love this ERP room. Thank you so much for being here, Mark. Ben, can I go for you next?
Yeah, hey Sam, good to be back. Ben Cole here, President ERP Connect. We're focused on D365 Business Central, both implementation and add-on applications in the marketplace.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here. We have a lot of representation from Microsoft. We have some Sage, Acumatica, BlueLink, a lot of different ERP systems, which is wonderful. This is what I personally like. If you are in the audience and joining for the first time, make sure you write comments because I typically don't have a ton of questions. So I rely on your questions and we'll make sure that you receive your answers. If we run out of time, then you're going to get your answers afterwards by your panelist. On that note, I am going to start with the first question. And I'm going to set the stage a little bit, Chris, for you. Overall, as I said, when I look at the AR, AP, in my mind, they have always been slightly more sales jobs because, these teams especially, they don't get as much attention in the organization the way other teams are going to be, but the amount of work that they need to do to make sure that the cash is going to be collected, even from the vendor side, it's a very tricky position to be in, overall the way their jobs work. And nowadays, we are seeing a lot of automation, crazy amount of automation in the AR and AP space. So obviously the roles are going to change, the KPIs are going to change. So Chris, over to you, whatever you want to touch on.
Sure. I mean, and just the automation gives you a great segue as you think about some of the KPIs that are applicable to both AR and AP. And, you go back to what's it cost me to process a single transaction? And that metric right there speaks to efficiency and automation, because you're like, well, is it $1.23 per AP invoice? You're like, wow, you can fix that. And I think that those are great metrics. And I think as you look at, what's a benchmark? I may not have an industry benchmark, but as you look at ROI for solutions, well, there's a perfect example. What is it today? If we, for example, add an OCR AI capability to integrate invoices, well, what does that do to my cost per invoice to process? And there's a perfect example. Am I moving the needle? But there's other ones. Again, if you're looking at the AR one, and I'm more in tune with money side. I like the money coming in. I like the money out. We could pay slow, but we want to get velocity. And I think that's another real good KPI on the revenue and the receivable side. Is you're looking at, is it called days sales outstanding? But you're looking at, okay, how quickly is my money showing up? And then again, as we go back to automation, and I got a benchmark, and if you say, hey, I'm net 30 and I'm a $12 million company, if people are paying you 30 days, you should have $1 million in AR. Well, if it's $1.5 million, that means that you're averaging about 45 days, right? If we bill $1 million a month, we should, 30 days. But I think you're looking at that metric as to, well, if that's my benchmark and we're trying to get people to pay us between 30 and 45, where's it at? And then I guess, as we apply automation, how do we move it? How do we measure progress against these benchmarks? For example, in the AR area, automatic bill and pay. Hey, how do we collect money? People mail checks, or are there more efficient ways to have the cash coming in? Same thing. That impacts the velocity of the receivables coming in. It impacts the cost per transaction. And certainly, what do? We have a lot more cash in the bank, and that's what people want, is more cash in the bank. I think there's other metric that may be common across both as I think about discounts given versus taken. Probably more on the AP side again, and it may even be a discounts lost. Whereas we rationalize revenue, again, this is a revenue deal on the AP side, discounts lost. Why am I losing discounts? And if the company is cash positive, you should never lose discounts, right? You should always be paying. So that's just a few that I'll mention there, but they're all really revenue centric from my perspective.
Yeah, so some very interesting commentary there, and I am going to hit on some of those, and then maybe you are going to have some follow-up commentary there. And by the way, MEC, overall from the series perspective, I was thinking that we should probably, as a team, what we should do is, because there are going to be some listeners who might not be familiar with these KPIs.
Sure.
So if we can offer any sort of examples to make it easier, because if you look at the bookish definition, you can probably Google it, but it's very hard to understand what it means in the real world.
Right. What's days sales outstanding?
Exactly.
Yeah, I get it. And I didn't want to rattle them all off so the other guys don't say you used them all. Anyway, so which one?
So I'm going to hit on some of those, and I'm going to offer some examples as well here. So when you mentioned the cost to process transaction, great comment there, okay? That's what you should be measuring on. Now, the other things that you mentioned, OCR and AI, there are some interesting comments there that based on the trends that we are seeing in the industry. Utilize AI, but make sure that your admin effort is not going to be more. We are seeing those trends as well, where you just didn't understand the architecture, you didn't understand how many different reconciliation paths are going to be there, what data you are going to reconcile. So we are seeing that even after incorporating technology, the companies are actually increasing the effort. Money in, money out. Great comment there, okay? That's how working capital works. And that's why I always find the AP's job very interesting as well, because their job is to slow down the money. Okay, the slower they can do, the more working capital you are going to have. So there is a strategic component there in that as well. And you hit on some of the discount given and the discount ones as well. I really like those. And the measurement, I really enjoyed that as well. So I don't know, Chris, if you are going to have any other commentary
there.
Sure. My comments.
To your point about AI and automation, what we're trying to do is focus on exceptions. And I think one of the challenges a lot of businesses have is they touch everything. Okay, that's the problem. And so now hey, can I get 90%? I had a group that was, moving about 10,000 invoices a week. And so as you think about the, to your point, there's a few different variations that'll come in where they throw an exception, right? Oh, it's a variance. They shipped me something I shouldn't. But there's one example where as you put automation in here, it's not going to do 100%. It's never going to be, but how much of that workload can we not touch? It's no different than cash application on the AR side. Can I get automation and applying invoices and cash? Right? Float the exceptions. What we do is we reduce those workloads. So like I said, in any context, there's incremental progress, but it's measuring that, right? And again, everybody, how do I calculate my cost per invoice? Well, how many AR clerks do I have and how many invoices I do? That's a pretty simple division. You're like, wow, you fire somebody, now I have 2 clerks instead of 3, the cost just went down. We get down to 1 clerk. I had a group that had 9 cash application resources. What they do, they put a portal out there, got rid of 7 people, they have 2. Well, their cost per transaction dropped dramatically. Sure, they put technology in, which that factors into that cost per transaction, but that's a perfect example of how you're measuring.
Amazing insights there. Thank you so much, Chris. So Abu, I'm coming over to you. I'm going to touch on some of the other comments that I wanted to touch based on Chris's commentary. So you can touch on that or whatever you have to offer related to KPIs for ARAP. So basically, the cost to process transaction in that, there are many different things that companies can incorporate. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with things like P-card. It's a very common mechanism to incorporate as part of your AP process. And the whole idea there is if the cost to process transaction is going to be more than the line item itself, meaning if the PO is going to be for $100, but to process that is going to cost you $150, it doesn't make a ton of sense, right? So they are going to give a tiny credit card to all of the purchaser for the smaller purchase. Now we are seeing very, very, very interesting trends similar to this in other spaces where they have a similar virtual card for SaaS spend, meaning anything that you are going to, because we have like so many different SaaS products. Okay, so they are releasing a similar P card just for that spend. Can you believe this? Okay, so these are some very interesting trends that we are seeing overall from the ARAP perspective. So Abu, over to you, whatever you want to hit on.
Yeah, I mean, from a trend perspective, I think AP automation is probably, the hottest thing these days, right? And especially with the new technologies, with the NLP and the AI, because one of the things is, invoice. If you have a simple business, your invoice comes in and you can process it. But if it relates to a project, if someone has to verify that an actual product movement happened, based on the dollar amount, so that's where the AP automation starts struggling in. You can do those matches, but then sometimes the data is a bit more complicated, right? You have to verify that service happened, contractual complexities around those services, right? And that's where the AP automation tools start to fail. And that's where the cost, so a lot of companies implement it and then they still find they have to implement so much automation, logics, algorithms, that the cost of developing those algorithms is higher than the cost saving of an actual person. So NLP is trying to change that. NLP is natural language processing. So you look at the invoice and then see how will a human interpret that. So those are some of the upcoming AP automation. On the AR side, one thing that you have a lot of metrics, which like sales outstanding, turnovers, and so on. But one thing often, especially in manufacturing or engineer to order industries or project industries or even our IT industries, the time to create an invoice. So you have to factor in so much data together to create an invoice, and you gather the data, then the invoice gets created, then somebody has to approve the invoice. Project hours, can we bill this hours or not? If this in scope or not. So the time it takes to create the invoice is often not measured, right? So when the invoice gets created in the system, you're measuring your days outstanding or the days to collect from that point onward. But it may have taken you 20 days just to create the invoice. And that's often a metric that a lot of companies do not track. And if they start tracking it and try to compress that time frame, that will again improve on their sales time frame.
Okay, so very interesting insight. So I'm going to hit on some of the things that you mentioned, and then if you have any follow-up comments there, you can mention those. So the matching process is very interesting in general. And a lot of people talk about, can we automate everything? And you also mentioned that, what cost to develop. Cost to develop is just one aspect. You always are going to have the cost to reconcile as well, regardless of how much technology you have, because you still have to verify. I mean, I don't know if there is going to be any system that can be bulletproof that, okay, I fire my command and that's it, done. I don't ever have to check. I don't think the technology is supposed to work that way, right? So even if you have all of the automation, what is the cost to reconcile is where my take always is it's not going to be just the development that you understand. You have to also analyze your overall maintenance or admin cost. I should say maintenance is going to be more from the technology perspective. Time to create invoice is a very interesting one. And I don't know, I don't know if anybody is going to touch on the subscription side of things. That could get very interesting as well, especially if the business has never explored the subscription based business model and now they have to do ASC 606 compliance. So I don't know if anybody is planning to touch on that. Abu, if you have any commentary related to changing to subscription based business model, because there is a way the AR KPIs need to be structured, the way the AR processes need to be structured. So if you have any commentary there or any other comments.
I mean, I have just from a subscription-based model, it's handling those, when does it renew, what's included, if a change in the subscription happens. So you need all the systems and processes in place to capture this changes in subscription. I think that would be the key, and again, from a technology perspective, as well as a process perspective to change how you're charging out, right? So for example, within our company, we have some software modules that, people can buy the subscription. The key challenges are when to onboard it, does it renew, when does it expire, the new changes are coming in, how to capture all this and change requests and process from my perspective.
Okay, amazing insights there. Thank you so much, Abu, for that. So Narav, I'm coming over to you, and whatever you want to hit on overall from the KPI perspective, if there are any new KPIs that you have come across in your experience related to ARAP or whatever these guys have touched so far, I guess.
Yeah, no, Chris and Abu did a great job of kind of, diving into that role of AR and AP. Their main objectives, right, is to essentially manage the inflow and outflow of cash, right? But sometimes, you got to take a step back. We're talking about cost of transactions, cost of generating invoices, all this stuff. But how can the AR and AP teams generate in revenue for the company? Right, there's another way of looking at these departments, because ultimately AR is protecting your revenue stream, making sure that revenue is coming in, is being collected in full, right? There's no bad debt expenses, things like that. That's happening. And then on the AP side, right, you're maximizing your savings. You want to go ahead and get the fullest extent for your discounts that you could take, and negotiating with vendors properly, right? Negotiating favorable terms at the end of the day to increase the bottom line. So KPIs, when it relates to I feel software, should be around, these two areas, is how to protect the cash, the revenue that's coming AR, and then how to maximize our savings and increase our profits bottom line from the AP side. So it's a kind of a really important distinction, instead of just, trying to put AR and AP in the standard light that it's always been. But, where are the competitive advantages that, you could get out of these two departments, right? Yeah, you could evaluate KPIs and all these other things, but you have to look internal. You have to look at the systems that you got to look at, what type of issues do you see day in and day out, right? What type of errors, what vendors that you've been working with for a long time, for example, right? Is it time to now renegotiate terms? Are we ordering more than we ordered before so we get some better purchase discounts and stuff? So that's really where you could take that information you get and start turning around and actually having some increases in your bottom line at the end of the day. So it's one of those things that that department as a whole, both those departments as a whole, have a big impact on the company. It's not just these two small departments off in the corner, and they just kind of do their own work and no one really recognizes what's happening, right? They have to be part of the value added chain that you're providing, because everyone should have that hat on. So it's managing that, and then at the same time, it's trying to get customers to look at the way you're looking at your AR department, right? To say, hey, our team is focused on providing you really good invoices that are accurate, not with like bad pricing, because our pricing is not set up properly in our ERP system. So now all of our invoices, a majority of invoices are always being questioned, right? And that makes you lose your credibility. And then also the quantities, what you're shipping, is that accurate at the end of the day? So the vendor, the customer knows exactly what they're being billed for, right? On the vendor side, are we actually getting billed for what we're buying, or is there always issues there? Essentially, so it's one of those where KPIs are important and necessary to manage and monitor, but how are you going to build up those two departments to essentially become revenue generating, I feel like at the end of
Yeah, could not agree more. Great insights. And I completely agree that AR and AP could be very strategic. Obviously, if you have the data and the connectivity and traceability, then only they are probably going to be strategic. But I mean, if you look at AR, AP, we have sort of created these boundaries. And I don't know whether you share this sentiment or not. Typically the way AR, AP works, and I don't know if you have seen any other structures, but typically the way the organizations are going to be structured, that's how your systems are going to be structured. The way your architecture is going to work. So AP is typically part of procurement, but they could also be part of your accounting team. Okay, so where do they belong? Are they part of accounting team or should they be part of procurement? Because that is what is going to dictate which systems are they going to buy. Because if this goes from the departmental budget, then they are going to have a very different architecture. So now let's talk about AR automation, AP automation. Now, if they are going to be completely disconnected, then you are maintaining two different instances. Your vendor could be a customer. So, are they going to be in both of this AR, AP automation? And that is actually going to drive your KPIs as well. Every KPIs is like, this overarching layer that is based on everything that you have in the architecture. So I don't know, based on my commentary, whatever follow-ups you have.
Yeah, I mean that's the latest wave, right? All the automation that you could build into your ERP, purchase. So a lot of ERPs also come with it out of the gates. But if you don't have good processes internally, those automations are going to create bad results, right? You're seeing bad results now. You're going to get bad results with the automation, right? First, you need to make sure internally that the systems are prepared to handle the automation that's going to be accurate at the end of the day, and you're not doing a lot of cleaning up. But automation, payment processing, collection management, credit management, all these pieces, right? These are kind of what I call neighborhood watchdogs, right? What's happening in the business, right? At the end of the day, are we getting properly billed? Are we collecting the right amount of cash at the end of the day? So they should, I think, in a sense, be independent, if you will, right? You have the procurement team, you have your finance team, but they're making sure that everyone is all the transactions are coming are fair for the business at the end of the day. So those are really good points. I think those have to be independent, AR and AP, because you're feeding all the information to the financials, but you have to get the data that you need to properly make decisions to help the sales team, help the purchasing team, right? But then also make sure that our financials are looking strong because we are doing the right processing of those, whether it's on the AR and the AP.
Okay, amazing insights there. Thank you so much, Nirav. So Mark, I'm coming over to you, and in your space, my assumption is going to be that these smaller customers are not going to have as many departments, as many roles. There's going to be one guy who's doing purchasing, AR, AP, everything, I guess, and so sometimes that could get interesting as well, and that is going to drive how your systems are going to be structured. Let's say if one person is acting, then I don't know how you separate those, right? So in your space, whatever you are seeing overall from the organizational structure perspective, and that will probably drive their KPIs as well. Mark, over to you.
Right, thanks, Sam. Well, listen, I mean, our customer's not that small. So, typically there is actually a separation between AR and AP, but usually they kind of fall under the finance or the controller or the CFO's kind of portfolio. But they usually are separate, and sometimes to the company's detriment. Some of the points you hit on, I've actually seen a disconnect where, a policy is put in place to try and take advantage of early payment discounts on the payable side without taking into account a program that's going to cost more money on the receivable side than on the outflow side because of that, right? But I'm also mindful of we use the term KPIs and we throw them around kind of, maybe a little bit loosely. There are a lot of metrics in any organization that you could be tracking. The question is, which ones should you be tracking? Who should be tracking them? Why are you tracking them? What do you learn from them? And the K in KPI is key. And I've always felt that any individual who's in charge of something and uses KPIs, there's a limit to how many KPIs are really the key performance indicators. And I see so many times people are tracking, just even in payables, I've seen customers tracking, I've got a list of some of them here, and like 8, 9, 10 different metrics. And one of the reasons they're tracking them is because, hey, we've always tracked them. And we all know what a great reason that is for doing stuff, right? Because we always did it that way. So I look at what are you trying to achieve and what is that measure telling you? And also, is that measure still accurate? As everybody has said eloquently on this, technology is changing everything. Digital invoices, EDI, electronic data moving around, different payment methods. Companies that were only selling purely B2B now selling a mix of B2B and B2C. And the B2C transactions will go through a completely different flow, but you don't separate them. Suddenly it looks like your average collection days are amazing. They've gone from like 47 days to 22 days. But that's because 50% of your transactions are being paid up front by B2C customers, and nobody thought to go and tweak the data or look at what's behind it. So I think in the accounts payable space in particular, electronic payment has thrown havoc amongst some of the metrics that many small to medium-sized companies use. A lot of them are ignoring the fact that, we used to print checks when we were ready, and then we used to maybe hold them on our desk, which caused a whole other category of problems, until we felt comfortable releasing them. Now we pay via, ACH, and we upload a batch to the bank, and it's gone out of bank account the next day. But we're still taking the old cycle of let's look at this once a week because we're doing these things on a weekly basis. You're not measuring what's happening in real time. The other side of that, though, is, and this is, you like stories, Sam, I know that.
Yeah.
So this is a really practical story. So we have a customer, we still have them in this situation, fairly big customer by our standards, and they are very resistant to switching to electronic payment of vendors. They insist on printing checks for all their vendors. They're generating between 400 and 500 checks a month in multiple check runs. And the majority of those checks sit in a stack of paper on one person's desk until that person decides, you know what, there's enough cash in the bank, I'm going to ship these out. But there's another department that is relying on the ERP software to tell them if they're in good payment status with, this is the purchasing department, if we're in good status with our suppliers before we place another order. Can't tell you how many times the purchaser places a PO that's declined by the vendor because of unpaid bills, and the purchaser's looking at the screen and saying, but we cut a check 3 weeks ago. But of course, the check's sitting on someone else's desk. So your KPIs, which revolve around your supplier discounts captured, etc., they're all wrong. They're correct based on the data in the system. They're not correct based on the real life activity. So yeah, I think when we do deal with receptive small and medium sized customers on things like the metrics you need to manage your business, which are really the KPIs, we try and make them be realistic and practical about what you should be caring about, and also how you should be calculating it. I'll give you, just to hog the floor for a bit. I'll give you another example on the accounts receivable side. So we inherited a customer that was very, very focused on tracking the average payment days for their customers in order to determine most of their customers, very big companies in construction, but in a sector of construction that was very seasonal and companies would go out of business quite frequently. So very worried about credit. So one of the key metrics they were using was average payment days over the course of a construction project when they were supplying suppliers regularly to the construction site. Their old system didn't provide an automatic calculation, so they were calculating it manually. What they were doing is they were weighting the payment days based on the number of invoices and the days in which those invoices were paid. They were ignoring the dollar value of the invoice because most invoices were more or less for the same amount. Well, one of their biggest customers had a big cash flow crunch, was worried about being cut off. So they realized what was going on. So instead of placing, say, one big order a month, they would place 3 orders a month, 2 small ones and pay them immediately, and then one really big one and not pay it for 90 days. So they were showing this customer was paying I think on average 27 days. But if you weighted it correctly by dollars, they were actually paying 78 days on terms of net 45. They eventually ended up writing off about $4 million when this company went bust.
Yeah, love the stories. Love the AP story that, you really need to dig into details to really understand what the data is telling you. Loved your the check story as well. That's very interesting. And I'm always looking to find the underlying reasons why this customer was so adamant of not moving away from checks. Were there any reasons? Did they tell you anything? What's going on there? Why they're so afraid?
Yeah, so it's a business where one generation of the family is gradually handing over the business to the next generation, and the older generation have been running business for 44 years or something, and part of their regular process of running their business from when it was a little small place with one outlet to now where they've got 20 locations across North America was we look at every single check, we look at the backup paperwork, and we decide if we're comfortable releasing it, and until we retire, that. Hey, that's what the guy enjoys doing, right? He goes into the office because he enjoys manipulating paper and doing all the things he's been doing for 44 years. It's a terrible way to run the business, and it's probably going to stop when eventually he actually retires full time.
Yeah, and this sounds like a Seinfeld conversation where the guy is wondering, okay, no checks going out? How does that business work?
Yeah. That's actually a good way of characterizing it. Yeah, I never thought of that. That's a good one.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that. So, Ben, I'm coming over to you. Any commentary that you have based on these guys' comments or whatever you can share from the KPIs perspective, Ben?
Yeah, definitely. It's always hard going last, right? Because everybody takes all the good answers up front. But no, I think a lot of good things over what everybody said. I think one of the main things I was trying to bring to it, which a few people touched on, is really the fact of having that real-time data, right? If you're booking things 15, 20 days after they're coming in, it's really hard to use KPIs and actually make any decisions off of them, right? So I think taking a step back first before saying, okay, these are the most important KPIs, it's having that data good, having it real time, and with that, typically automating as much as you can, right? I think one of the first things Chris talked about is you got 9 people manually typing in things, right? Well, there's so much good technology out there today that you shouldn't have that many people doing anything, right? Automate as much as you can from that point. It will reduce the amount of errors you're having in the system and also increase the reliability and decrease the amount of time needed to get that data in the system. So I think 100% that's probably the most important thing, right? You have to have the not only technology but the people and processes in place to have all those things work together, right? They all work in tandem, and they're all working at the same time. So after you have that, then I think you can start to use the real-time data from a quantitative standpoint to have the people that you have left still doing the work to focus more on the qualitative aspects, right? Because again, like we've been talking about, Mark put it very well, right? You have all this data. I see clients that have 30 KPIs on a chart. Okay, well, KPIs are there to make decisions and improve business off of, right? They're not there just to look at and look nice. So if you don't have an action plan on the KPIs are worthless no matter how good the data is, right? So one of the first things that I always do when either creating dashboards or just using somebody's dashboard or metric that already exists in a system is say, okay, what is the metric and what is your plan to improve it and why are you using it to improve, right? So I know you like stories and we're telling a lot of good stories, right? So I had a client that was on the AR side. They were looking at things and said, we're not getting cash fast enough. What can we do? Let's look at KPIs. And I was like, okay, well, we looked at day sales outstanding. That's great, but we went one level deeper and actually looked at kind of the payment trends from the customers to look at both the last payment date from the customer as well as the average paydays for the customer at a customer by customer level. And we said, okay, let's make an action plan to make that quicker for everyone. So we ended up implementing an AR automation tool that not only gets the invoices out very quickly to the customer, also allows the customer to now pay on a portal, which eliminating any of the barriers to a customer paying is always great. If you put your ACH details on your invoice, but they typically write checks or do something else, anything that makes it more difficult for a customer is going to increase the amount of time it takes them to pay you, right? And then the last thing we did was send out automatic dunning and reminder notices for the invoice when they were coming 3 days before they were due, and then every 5 days after they were due, right? Because a lot of times, even if just a little email comes through, it will remind them to pay and maybe it makes it on their next payment run, right? So we, after doing all of that, by taking KPIs and putting together actionable items on day sales outstanding, last payment date, average paydays for the customer, right? We ended up reducing the amount of time it took to get their money almost by 30%, right? And that all kind of comes back together to cash is king, right? The faster you can get that cash in, the more you can invest, the more working capital you have, the more risk you can take because you have more cash, and the faster you can grow your business. So I always like to look at that story, and I like to focus on the AR side more as well because I like money coming in. I don't like paying bills, but I will talk about the AP side as well because that's very important too. And one of the cool things I think that Nirav mentioned, right, is how do we look at this from a revenue generating standpoint? I never really look at it from that standpoint, but you got me thinking when you said that, and I think it's good to call out because most people look at it at both of them as a cost center, right? But on the AP side of things, if we want to talk about that, right, looking at spend by vendor, right, these huge vendors that you have, if you're spending a lot of money with them and you're one of their biggest customers, it might be easy to get more favorable terms. It might be easy to get bigger discounts. Look at what you're buying compared to what you're buying from other vendors to see if you can get any better pricing on an item by item basis, right? A lot of things you can do if you're a big, reliable customer, if you're one of their top customers, right? Looking at payment term discounts as well as interest or penalties, right? Two things to look at on the opposite side of the spectrum. If you want to capitalize on as many early pay terms as you can from the vendor, if you have the cash, of course. So that's why we look at AR first, get the cash in, so then you can take advantage of those terms. And then you want to avoid as many late penalties as you can on the AP side. So again, they're two separate entities typically at mid-size and large companies, but they all really work together in the full ecosystem of your business, right? And that all comes back to the average processing time, getting things in quickly, analyzing everything together from that full life cycle, and really making sure that it all works together so that you never have to worry about the cash, because it's all in that, circle of life, and it all kind of continues to flow. And if you do have to take out debt or loans or anything like that, right, you're looking across the whole board as to why. And before you do that, maybe look how you can improve your AR, right? So a lot of different things. I know we could talk about this for probably hours. So I'm sure you have another prompt you want to get to, but that's kind of how I've brought everything together from what we've talked about so far, I think.
Yeah, no, great coverage. And I'm going to touch on some of the things that you mentioned, and then whatever follow-up you might have, and you can mention those. So first thing, overall, AR versus AP comment. I mean, this is always going to be very controversial in general, okay? And you can call me out on this one, but I actually like to pay attention a lot more on APs because the good vendors are very hard to, okay? Mm-hmm. Unless you are buying something like toilet paper, which is very easy to replace in general, but everything else is super important. And good, reliable vendors are very hard to find. So we pay equal attention to AR versus AP. Now, on the AR side, okay, there are going to be a bunch of customers. These customers, let's say they are paying $5,000 per month, and they require 15 reminders before they can pay. Do you really want that customer? I probably don't. So, I think AR, AP, it depends upon how strategic the transaction is, how strategic the relationship is, what is going to be your dependence. If you are going to be a headache for any company, they'll probably move on, because obviously everybody. Now, to your comment related to real-time data, that's very interesting as well. When you look at the automation, especially if you are dealing with these smaller companies, sometimes that is easier to do just because you don't have as many debates, okay? When you are working with larger companies, these companies are going to buy a lot of different SaaS applications, and then they don't necessarily understand the architectural implications. Sometimes that is going to be by design, because somebody said something, and because of that, they simply implemented it, and now they are figuring out, okay, how they are going to reconcile. And sometimes that becomes, let's say, batch data. And then if they are going to be measuring their KPIs, it's all over the place, because that is across the system boundaries, and they have no way of doing the same things that you are trying to describe. It becomes very expensive project in general, because they are doing after the fact. So Ben, I don't know, I touched on two different issues. So whatever you want to hit on, if you have any follow-ups.
Well, going on the last issue you talked about, right, in the real time, right, it's getting everything real time at the same time, because every good dashboard or BI thing that you make, right, has 4 or 5 inputs, right? So if one is 15 days old and another input in the same graph is 2 days old, right, now you're not even comparing apples to apples. So I 100% agree with that piece. Absolutely key to do so. Remind me what the first one was again. I kind of looped them both.
Yeah, the first one, AR versus AP.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Totally agree with you there. And I'm not an advocate of not paying your bills. I put my AP on autopilot, right? And I suggest everyone does to an extent, right? The things that you're not getting terms on and you're going to get penalties on, just pay right before the date for cash flow. Anything you can get payment terms discounts on, pay immediately, and keep those good vendors around as long as you can. Most of my stuff's on auto pay, right? And if clients have that luxury, I would say, then you don't even have to worry about it. Just auto pay it, get the early terms discounts. Everything else, just make sure you pay before the pay date and put it on autopilot. Keep your vendors happy. As long as the money keeps coming into the vendor before it's due, they're always going to be happy, and they're going to keep supplying you, right? So definitely not an advocate of paying anything late. I pay everything on time.
Yeah, could not agree more. Thank you so much for that. So Chris, coming over to you. Any comments over comments, stories over stories, any bad KPIs?
All that. Ben, did you build auto pay for Business Central yet?
I built a tool that does the reminder piece of it. I don't have a payment portal because I don't want to deal with PCI compliance, but I built the emailing portion of it.
So, comments over comments. I mean, there were some interesting perspectives. Again, we talk about macro receivables or payables, but one comment that was made, I guess, Abu, you made this, is again, you go back to time to invoicing and you think about the impact that you can have on sales and their behaviors and what are those, to that point, is velocity. We ship the product. How long does it take the invoice to get out? We delivered the service. How long does it take the invoice to get out? And that's a great metric. And I think the other one we didn't talk about is you start looking at the individual transaction. And right, what is the revenue per invoice? And then we'll talk about the sales side. What's the revenue per invoice? But what about the margin and profitability? And if you start thinking to that good customer, bad customer, there's absolutely, I'm not going to name names, but there's a conversation with somebody right now that is paying me like net never, like 9 months out. And she's like, oh, I want a discount. I'm like, why? And so you rationalize. And again, how do you have a KPI on a good customer? And who are good customers? And I think that businesses miss that. So there are analytics out there to help you. And again, you're looking at your sales rep performance and the types of transactions he's booking in terms of that profitability and how he's setting price and margin. And again, our cost per invoice impacts what's the profit per invoice. And to your point, we have some transactions we're doing in Latin America. And I'm like, how much are we billing a month? I go, we're losing money on them. To your point is it costs more to handle the transaction than it does to book the transaction. And so these are analytics that are now, I'm not managing collections or cash or expected money and some of that, but now we're down. It's trying to influence the behaviors of the organization, who they sell to, who they onboard as a customer. I even had a metric here as you think about, AR performance against the credit score of the customers. What's the correlation between how we credit score people versus how they perform in terms of reciprocation and payments? And I think that was an AI comment and another thing I do where we get automation of updating credit scores so that the systems, we have that data to rely on. But now we're really getting down into the transactional behavior on the rep performance based on looking at analytics on the individual documents. And again, that factors into our cost and profit. Just a little different ones, but like I said, time to invoice, those are huge deals. And you're like, well, how do you get it faster? And again, depending on the nature of your business, if you're a distributor, just like the auto pay, the auto invoice. So, there's rationalization. We talked about that on the backside. Once you ship the product, invoice it. We don't need people. So those are great examples of processes. How do you automate it? Or as you dissect, but again, the KPIs are going to help substantiate if those types of improvements in processes. Just a couple thoughts.
No, great comments and great thoughts there. And Chris, I want to hit on just one aspect there that was in between. And I think that is very interesting. I don't know how companies are handling that. That was B2C versus B2B. I think Mark had made that comment, right? So typically when you look at these smaller businesses, they are going to combine both B2C as well as B2B transactions. And it's a very interesting conversation from the KPI perspective, because should AR be involved in those B2C transactions because it's already paid? So, I don't know if they should be involved. So I don't know, Amisi, typically in your experience, when you look at B2C versus B2B processes, are they completely segmented? That B2B is going to be a completely different customer vendor base, or are they shared?
What changes is the way you conclude the transaction, meaning are you giving them terms? And I think in the B2C world, there's not as much terms extended, again, because a lot of those are coming through the e-com cycles, right, where they're paying up front. So, is there less admin on those? If you're a distributor, you still got to pick, pack, and ship, but they're paid in full. There's no collections activity. So I think in the B2C, you're going to see a lot more prepaid type of transactions flowing through, whereas in a B2B world, you're almost always going to have terms. You may have some prepaids on big projects and so forth, but a little different structure there. So the backside collections and handling may be a little bit thinner on the B2C, again, assuming they're coming in through an e-com portal. But again, depending on the nature of retail, if it's retail, you're cash, right? Your point of sale, you're basically point of service, I should say, where you're tendering versus backside where you're giving them terms and they're working you 30, 60, 90 days to that. But yeah, so there are some differences there. And companies that do commingle them, do they have different teams that are managing different customers? I'm sure that they're analyzing the metrics because, again, as you look at commercial customers, are they going to get a different level of service than the B2C customers? There's going to be differentiators there. And so, again, cost per transaction, I got to manage it differently. My commercial customers, they're big accounts. There's a lot more profit to that customer versus this customer. So, again, they should have similar service levels, but I'm sure there's going to be the profit that they have to work with and allocate team members, right?
Yeah, that's how business works. Thank you so much, Chris, for that. Abu, coming over to you. Any comments, anything that you want to hit on from our conversation, any other stories that you may have or KPIs?
Yeah, from a story perspective, one thing that we forget is, you can monitor the KPIs, but oftentimes AR, AP, they tend to be, accounts payable clerks or accounts receivable clerks, right? And they don't tend to be rewarded the same way, right? So rather than just monitoring the KPIs, it's also important to tie in their annual performance bonus increments to those KPIs as well, right? And not just from a whole departmental perspective, but also from an individual perspective. So from one company that we had, they had really complex invoicing rules and stuff. So what we started measuring was even things like time to create the invoice. Now the invoice is created, there's a whole approval process around it, right? Now, what is the time to post the invoice, right? The invoice is created, but how long does it take now to just post it and ship it out to the customer, right? And then we started tracking each and individual AR clerks around those performances. And then we built in rules around, next time the performance increment happens, you have to achieve certain timelines, like certain KPIs on your own individual performance to get an increment or get a bonus and so on. And that perspective, that viewpoint for us really helped us, that company really improve their time to invoice, because now each individual AR AP clerk was tied into those performance metrics. So we have to, also go down to a more granular level, especially if you're a larger company, to drive those processes.
Yeah, so very interesting comment here, and I want to peel a little bit more there. So when you look at, and obviously as the AR guy, you don't want to go too aggressive because you lose the customer, I guess. And I don't know, I mean, see, there is going to be a little handshake there when the salesperson needs to be involved if the customer is not paying. So in your experience, Abu, when you are setting up these performance bonuses, how do you set up? I mean, see, who gets the credit? Is it going to be the AR person, or is it going to be the salesperson who is finally collecting? Because as AR person, I don't know how much clout you have overall on the customer.
Yeah. So the AR person, so there are a lot of stuff that the AR person needs to do to get the invoice out, right? So I'm talking about more complex engineer to order project engineering companies, or where there's a more complex requirement around. It's not just you ship product A and then you just hit auto invoice. So on that perspective, sometimes they have a whole pile up of data in their dashboard or on the paperwork, whatever that they have to process, right, to push the invoice through. So we are just measuring them on the time to create the invoice, right? And in that aspect, we can measure them and then you can reward them. The collection is often AR person won't have the cloud, that you have to reward the sales rep on, right? So as I said, there are multiple things that you can track along the pipeline, right? How fast it took you to ship the order, how fast it took you to create the invoice, how fast it is taking you to get the money in, right? Sales reps are often rewarded on commission, are often based on when the money comes in, right? So they're all often on top of, okay, I need to get paid, right? But it's often, a lot of times, it's taking you 15 days or 30 days to get paid, but it's also sometimes taking you 15 days to create the invoice and send it out to the customer. So our customer, for that particular customer, what we focused on was that initial in-house period, how we can compress it, and how we can have the right reward and bonus to show that the AR clerk are responding to those.
Yeah, no, great insights. Thank you so much, Abu, for that. So, Nirav, I'm coming over to you. Any comments that you want to hit on? Any other stories that you plan to cover that you could not cover so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when you look at receivables and payables, especially start on the receivable side, how can I improve your customer relationship? Right? There's some matrix there where, if you have good automated processes, the customers gain their invoice on time, right? And it's accurate. They're paying quickly. That's a good indication that they like your service, right? Now, on the other side of it is that if they're paying late, right? I think you start digging into that using these KPIs, they're paying past, 15 days past due, they're paying 60 days past due. Well, there's a problem there. They might continue buying from you, but they really don't like your service, right? So how could you take that information that you get on the AR side, especially, use that as valuable feedback to see how you're doing as a business and improve that relationship with that customer? I think, you have the receivable and then you have CRM, the relationship management side of it. That's really important, because if you could service that customer well at the end of the day, they're going to continue buying from you and buy more from you, because they may have multiple vendors they're buying the same item from, essentially, and only feeding you invoices a few at a time or orders a few at a time because your back-end processes are not correct at this point, right? Or they're inaccurate, they're full of flaws. So really look at your receivable process, say, how can we get more business from this customer? Why are they paying late, essentially? And that's a good indication how you're doing operationally. Do you need to have maybe more automated processes? Are you not invoicing on time? I mean, all of us have professional services organizations. We get often, timesheets aren't put in, right, on a weekly basis. So we're always like, we want to go ahead and make sure we bill on a weekly basis. But if you're not doing that and the customer's expecting a bill and all of a sudden they see a double or triple bill coming in, 2-3 weeks later, chances are they're pretty frustrated, right? It doesn't help them with their cash flow. So it's important to monitor that, have a KPI in place. How are we servicing our customers properly? On the AP side is paying our vendors, right? If we're repeatedly paying our vendors on time, maybe taking advantage of discounts, let's pick up the phone with the vendor and say, hey, just want to get some feedback. Are we a good customer, right? If we bought a little more, could we get on a different tier, right? Essentially, and they'll be willing to have that conversation with you. So it's really important to get that good feedback and continuously improve those processes in those departments.
Yeah, so some very interesting insights here. So I want to touch on just one comment there. We'll dig a little bit more. So the accurate payment, sometimes the customers could be completely happy, but they might not have as competent, I guess, the person who paying the bill. That could be a case when you might not have the accurate payment. I don't know if you have seen similar things from the KPI perspective. So let's say, if the payment is always going to be accurate, I don't know if that is really the customer satisfaction. Any other comments there by any chance?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's true, right? I don't think any automation in place, if on the other side, that invoice is not being handled properly, right? You could get the invoice directly the next second to the person's inbox and available, or, right, the best future-proof option right there is just taking it directly if they had a portal where you can upload the invoice that goes into their AP system, right? And automatically starts transacting, starts aging the invoice to get that paid automatically. I mean, once there's humans involved in the process, there's risk of the process and breaking down. But if you have a good relationship with that customer and they're willing to pay you on time and they've done it historically, it's easy to pick up the phone and say, hey, I have a little bit of a concern of what's going on. We've been trending in this direction, the last month or so, things have been kind of looking in a different direction. Is there something that I'm doing, right? Is there a flaw in my process? And how can we improve that to make sure that, as you're processing our invoices, that we could, keep up in the same payment cycle that we've been doing this whole time. So, it's having that just conversation sometimes are also important without, with AI and everything else there, right? I think just picking up the phone and just understanding what the other company's going through at the time is important because, you might find a common ground to help each other out.
Yeah, exactly. And great commentary there. So, Mark, I'm coming over to you. And when you look at all of these exception scenarios, typically, when you look at the accurate payment, I don't know, you are always going to have those exceptions. And that's why AR exists. And, there is no replacement for that because they are almost like your customer service apps who are going to be working with the customer to resolve these and to make sure that they are going to be comfortable. And now, when I look at the industry and they have things like conversational AI. Okay. Sounds fancy.
Don't get me started on that.
Right? But you don't want to be receiving an email from your chat GPT that I had problem in the invoice. Okay. That's not going to fly very well in my mind. So Mark, over to you. Any comment over comments, any stories, any comments on my comments?
Sure. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right in that there will always be disconnects it's not only with receivables. I mean, even, cash sales, online sales. A lot of our customers sell B2C online, as Chris said, where everything's prepaid. So, the price was X. Customer put in their credit card. The credit card was charged with that amount. The product gets shipped out, and then the customer says, well, actually, I thought it was $100 less. And, you get into dispute. But in general, in B2B scenarios, I think if we could assume that everybody had even moderately competent AP and AR people on both sides of the equation, there would be very few disconnects. It's not necessarily the AP clerks. And I want to actually pick up on, something that Abu said, is that I think a lot of times management and just full disclosure, I am a CPA by qualification. I used to be working in the accounting space. People who do what I used to do can sometimes get a little bit arrogant and blame, discrepancies in the department on, it's the AP clerk, it's the AR clerk. Often, no, it's not. It's your processes and systems that you've imposed on those people who are just doing their job. But it's easy to blame, the lowest person on the org chart kind of thing. But I do think that in our space where we deal with, companies that distribute anywhere from to the big box companies, but also to little mom and pop stores and mom and pop online stores, the dealing with the smaller companies definitely does tend to create potential discrepancies. And actually there's been a very interesting arc over the last 10 to 12 years in that space where many distributors that distribute to a mix of, big box and small companies, for the smaller customers, they've started mandating that they have to prepay the orders by credit card to avoid a receivable and avoid a mismatch, a record mismatch. And, you invoice them $1,000 and they pay you $987 and they got this pesky $13 receivable sitting there, but it happens every time. So you don't want to write it off every time, but you spend way more than $13 trying to collect the $13 in your collection process. So a lot of them have started doing that. And they've said, the credit card merchant fees, whatever the effective cost comes out to, 1.7% or 2% or whatever, is worth it because it's way less than the cost of A, trying to collect, and B, even the cost of manually processing the check when the check used to come in the mail. So we'll rather give up the percentage. But that's now coming around in a little bit of an arc because now you have the ability, as I think a couple of the people on the panel have already alluded to do things like, automatic payments, automatic receivables, ACH. So I mean, we've seen some of our customers take advantage of the feature we introduced where they're offering the customers, if they're let's say your terms are typically net 30, but we'll give you 1.5% discount if you're on 15 days, as long as it's based on pre-authorized ACH. So the 1.5% is a little bit less than the credit card merchant fees. The customer thinks they're getting a little bit of a break. We're not holding them to a credit card, but at the same time, we're actually saving money. And I'm seeing a trend in that kind of area. But I mean, I do want to also just pick up quickly on the processing time. Chris mentioned this, and I think Ben as well mentioned the processing time and the processing cost on accounts payable. And automation can be a wonderful thing, and I'm a big fan of automation. You may remember on one of these discussions last year, Sam, I had a little bit of an argument with one of the other panelists, no one on this panel, somebody else, about whether it was feasible to automate things. Somebody said, you can't automate things because systems are never perfect and you can only automate them when they're perfect. Well, we must have some perfect systems out there collectively, because it sounds like all of us on this panel have had some success with automation. Because, yes, you perfect a system, you perfect a process, you test, and then you automate it. The problem is that sometimes if you've not thought through all the exceptions, when you automate, whether it's paying payables or automating your three-way match between your receipts and your POs and your payable invoices, you end up spending more time and therefore more money on policing the exceptions than you're saving on the automation. So I'm a very big fan of automation, you know that, but I'm also a very big fan of be very cautious and continually evaluate whether you're actually getting the benefit.
Amazing insights, Mark. So we are probably not going to have time for the second question. So I'm going to move to Ben for his comments over comments. Anything that you want to share, Ben?
Yeah, looks like I got about 2 minutes for my closing remarks. But Mark, thank you for calling my systems perfect because we automate. I really appreciate that. That's the main thing I took out of that piece. But yeah, always looking at the cost benefit, right? How much does it cost to actually look into it versus how much does it cost to write off? One of the things we typically implement is a percentage or a dollar amount. Whatever the less of the two is, if it's within that threshold, just write it off because it's going to take more time to go chase it down from the people you have to pay who are chasing it down, right? If it's $5 and the invoice is 10,000, just write it off. Who cares? But you also get to the point where are people going to take advantage of that? Now they know you're going to write it off, so they always short pay you $5 because they have thousands of invoices a year, right? So again, cost benefit, you got to look at it qualitatively. Overall, comments on comments for the B2C versus B2B part. I definitely agree. I think there's less touch on the B2C side. Most people are prepaying or paying through a portal. A lot of times you have to pay even to just get it shipped out or get the service done, right? So a lot more touch on the B2B side, usually all on terms. And then the last thing, just from a metric and an overall comment standpoint, we talked a lot about getting paid on time and trying not to get paid late. I think one of the things we didn't talk a lot about, but we did touch on a little bit is bad debt to sales, right? Just completely not getting paid, right? And different from the write-offs, but just things that you're globally having to write off for an entire invoice, not just a small amount of the invoice, right? How do we decrease that? Not just late, but never, right? Why is it late? Is our service bad or is our product bad? Is it one or two bad apples in the bunch and just shouldn't be customers? Or is it common across everybody where we have a common problem with a service or a product, right? So some things just to keep an eye on. And I think, my overall comment for the whole KPI thing is don't track just to track. Always have a why. Have a plan for what action you're going to take based on that KPI. And if you can't take action on it, you shouldn't be.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Ben, for that. So I don't know if we are going to have time for closing advice, maybe a couple of words. Chris, closing advice?
Yeah, right behind you, Ben. I think make sure that your KPIs kind of correlate to a process so that when this one goes awry, I know what to go look for or remediate.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Chris. Abu, closing advice, please. Couple of words.
I'll just echo what Chris said. So please.
Okay, love it. Thank you so much. Nirav.
Yeah, if you're doing something manually, try to look at a way how you could automate it, make it more accurate for your customers and vendors.
Love it. Thank you so much. Mark.
Honestly, Ben said it perfectly. I can't improve on what he said. I just echo what he said.
Okay, love it. Ben, any other closing advice or are we good? Good?
Nope, all good.
Okay, love it, guys. Thank you so much. That's it for today. If you joined for the first time, this was part of our digital transformation series for Meet every Thursday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. So make sure you guys are going to be here next week. Most likely, we're going to have another session next week. On that note, thanks everyone for tuning in tonight.
Have a good one.
Thanks all.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Chris Garadini, head over to turnkey turnkeytech.com. It's turnkeytec.com. If you want to learn more about Abu Asif, head over to pennymanagement.com. It's PANNIMANAGEMENT.com. If you want to learn more about Ben Cole, head over to erpconnectconsulting.com. It's erpconnectconsulting.com. If you want to learn more about Nirav Shah, head over to excellerp.com. It's ADCIRRUSERP.com. If you want to learn more about Mark Haynes, head over to bluelinkerp.com. It's BLUELINKERP.com. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.